So I don't know. We might have a challenge. I mean, obviously there's lots of people that won't know any better. So
Right. Right. Whether it's easy or not.
oh, that one sounds like a nightmare.
You should go.
Nicole, don't tell her Nicole comes. Every time she comes back, I'm like, oh my god, really?
Oh my god.
And like Lane is a nice guy, but no, I'm not tough enough to be the chairperson of that.
No, I mean, thankfully, boring better.
Oh, good.
But even co-chair, so they really more so.
He's trying to, yeah.
I tried to like drop the because he was staying there in place for 5 years.
Yeah.
So now that we're back, I've tried to drop it. Then he got it where the less
I know, he's so nice, but yeah. Right. Well, it's a hard bunch. Like, a little bit willing to just be like, no, stop.
guys sitting in between.
Is the county supportive of what we're doing? And in terms of
Yeah. Oh, those are like the 2 words. Oh no. You learned your lesson now.
I was sitting there just kind of like trying to not like
Yeah, not make sense.
I just start concentrating so hard. I don't even remember what they were talking about. After the meeting, yeah, I was trying to make eye contact. I was like, no, it's no, take it.
Yeah, no, those are the 2 absolute words.
Yeah.
I do too, but he's got too.
But I think he just likes it.
He does. He's just a pop star. He's like, I'm bored. What can we stir up? Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. At the very least.
Hi everybody. This isn't working. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. There's probably a bus. Oh, it is. Oh, yeah. There.
I think it's on now? Hi everybody. Thanks for being here today. My name's Angela Hotailing and I am the program director at the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. We are a statewide environmental organization and we educate, engage, and empower New Yorkers to be environmental advocates. So thanks again for coming to our forum on coastal resilience. Thanks to Stony Brook Somas for hosting us. Thank you to Larry Swanson from the school, who's been a great host, and he's going to be our moderator today. And a special thanks to all of our panelists. Larry's going to introduce them in a minute. Just a couple housekeeping things. We're not doing paper programs. I know some of you might have picked up a flyer on your way in, but usually in the past we've done little pamphlets. We're trying to cut back on paper, so we're not doing that. We will have the panelists' names up on the screen, and if you signed up for the event through email, we'll send you the information following the event. If you didn't sign up, check in with Lisa here, who's in the front, and she'll get your information, and we'll make sure you get the video that we're taking, and any other follow-up that comes out after this. We're hoping to put out some resources that people can use, kind of lessons learned from this event, so stay tuned for that. So today we're going to talk about how we can make Long Island's coasts more resilient. It's a very timely topic. We often do these forums on timely environmental issues here on Long Island and in all of our chapter areas. So the League has chapters on Long Island, in New York City, Westchester, and Albany. And I'm actually really happy to say that we have one of our Long Island chapter board members here today who's actually going to introduce our first speaker. So, oh, sorry, I forgot to say one thing. If you drove here and you didn't get a parking permit and you don't want to risk getting a ticket, check in with Carlos at the front desk, and he'll give you a parking pass. Sorry, I almost forgot to mention that important thing. So anyway, one of our Long Island chapter board members is here to introduce our first speaker. Thanks so much, Michael Zapson.
Thank you, Angela. It's my pleasure to introduce Jack Schneerman. Jack Schneerman is the Comptroller of Nassau County. As Comptroller, Jack has brought a new energy to his position as the county's Chief Financial Officer. He has increased transparency through innovative approaches such as Open Checkbook and the Comptroller's Scorecard on the Open Nassau Transparency Hub, launched audits that have achieved results, and strengthened oversight of the county's finances and contracting process. His administration launched a policy and research unit focused on data-driven reports, fact sheets, and analysis to help inform the policy-making process, highlighting critical demographic trends, Black economic equality, veterans data, female entrepreneurship, food insecurity, the 2020 census, and how the county can retain and meet demands of the next generation. The Comptroller's Office has forged new partnerships with leaders in the nonprofit, MWBE, and tech communities, advocating for local businesses and pushing to grow our economy. So why is Jack speaking here today, right? He's great with finance and done a great job. 12 years ago, I met Jack Schneerman, and we were both board members of the League of Conservation Voters. A couple of years after that, I was on the search committee for a new city manager for the city of Long Beach. Jack applied for the job, and Jack became city manager of the city of Long Beach. Jack brought his abilities in government and budgeting and management to the city of Long Beach, and he did a wonderful job. But nothing could have prepared him for what was to come in October 2012, Superstorm Sandy. Sandy was an experience that changed everybody's lives here, there, throughout the whole region. It changed the way elected officials, appointed officials, government looked at how to deal with water issues, resiliency issues, how to address needs for the present, the future, and for generations to come. Jack lives in Long Beach with his wife Joan and his 2 children. He's got a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He's been a great advocate for environmental causes and for storm protection, hurricane protection, resiliency, and he really is a great speaker for us to have today. Jack?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Mike, for that generous introduction. So I'm Jack Schneerman. I'm your Nassau County Comptroller. I got the special visa to go across county lines here to Stony Brook, and navigating our successes and failures with resiliency today as I went up to the North Shore to from Long Beach to Glen Cove, out to here, and not too much flooding on a day like today, so that is good to see. So first I want to thank everybody for participating in what I think is an absolutely important dialogue, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that to everybody, that we have to have really a regional approach to resiliency issues, as this is not a Long Beach rainstorm today or a Stony Brook rainstorm today, but it is a regional rainstorm, and it's something that we all have to deal with. So just real quick, by show of hands, who here is representing a municipality today? And who is representing a nonprofit or advocacy organization? And other? Maybe you like the tuna fish sandwiches? Very good. Always good to have a sense of how expert the audience is and how clearly there's some wisdom in the room. So, as was mentioned, 7 years ago, Superstorm Sandy made landfall here on Long Island. I don't think I need to talk in too much depth about what that meant, except to say, from a quantitative perspective, it was big. Over $1 billion of infrastructure and resource damages just to that which is owned by government, right? That it's almost incalculable to talk about the loss in terms of individual homes. Over 100,000 homes damaged across Long Island. So unquestionably, as we look back over the last 7 years, there's been a lot that has been done to address, to rebuild, to begin to think about resiliency. But I think we are all here in part because we realize just how much more there is to do in the coming years, and how we've barely scratched the surface in so many ways. So why is the county's comptroller interested in getting involved in this beyond my obvious interest and sort of PTSD as a coastal city manager? It's because of my role to look out for where we can be smarter about our spending in county government. Not only do investments in resiliency pay a return on those investments and protect lives, they also save taxpayer money. So here's a couple of quick numbers to throw at you. According to the National Institute of Building Sciences, every dollar invested in resiliency and hazard mitigation yields $6 in future savings. Every dollar spent on improving building codes to better withstand natural disasters saves $4. Now that is obviously a pretty great return on investment. Plus, this is how we ensure that our region is a safe, smart investment now and for our next generations to come. It's how we protect our very ability to have an economy. A really quick story that I'd share is back in Long Beach when we were looking to rebuild our boardwalk, we wanted to do it as fast as humanly possible because it's so important to the city of Long Beach. We got into a little bit of a scrape with FEMA, who said that the Stafford Act only covers you building it back as was. As I see a lot of heads, right? So there was, after a lot of wrangling back and forth about what that meant, that number came out to be, if you factor in all sorts of things, something like, I think, $32 million. It's a big number. Turns out that to build the boardwalk with resiliency was $40 million. So from a financial perspective, I think we would all agree and ask the question, who in their right mind would spend $32 million on something that's going to be built inferior, that's going to be destroyed again at some point, we don't know when you can spend $40 million on something that we believe and we hope, and the best science and information engineering we have says our grandchildren will be around to enjoy. And that's the challenge that we face. So in our office, in the comptroller's office, we don't fancy ourselves the experts on resiliency. I think many of the folks in this room would take that title. Instead, we looked and we said, what role can we play in this discussion? And so we came up with 3 things. Number 1, we can serve as an information hub. Number 2, we can facilitate the use of Nassau Saves, which is the county's online shared services portal, because after all, this is about doing things together. And number 3, we can track our progress as we move and build and invest in resiliency as a county and as a region on our Open Nassau Transparency Hub. So strong resiliency fosters smart policies that help taxpayers. And it is critical to just make it as easy as possible for local municipalities to take advantage of programs that encourage local resiliency, right? We live in a time where local municipalities are cash-strapped, don't necessarily have the capacity in-house to be expert in everything, and really need a hand from other levels of government in order to say, these are the best practices. This is what you can do. This is what is available to you. This is what you ought to consider, and this is an easy way. To implement. And I'll give a shout out to the League of Conservation Voters, who's always been a very thoughtful partner to government in the sense that of providing that kind of wisdom. Hey, here's something that we recommend. here's the 3 steps you can take to implement it, and go ahead and we'll support you and provide you some wisdom along the way. And having been involved in those initiatives, I think those of us in government are greatly appreciative for that. So for all those reasons, last month I joined advocates from the League of Conservation Voters, from the Citizens Campaign for the Environment, the Sustainability Institute at Malloy College, to announce our initiative, which is the Resiliency Progress Tracker. It's a critical effort that supports moving forward for our whole region when it comes to climate change, sustainability, and resiliency. I'm going to hit some button here and see if I can figure out how to show you the tracker as I talk. I am not sure.
Let me see if I can help you.
Okay. I was guessing, and I guessed wrong. So to describe it broadly as we get started, there we go. Perfect. Okay. Great, thank you so much. So we need to continue to make comprehensive forward-looking improvements at every level of government. It's something we know. And to our systems and infrastructure so that we're ready for future storms. In that vein, the Comptroller's Office is compiling information and displaying it on our Open Nassau Transparency Hub. So this goes through our Open Nassau Transparency Hub here, so that everyone can see what's being done to prevent another weather-related catastrophe and build stronger, safer communities. I'll scroll through it a little bit as we chat. That information is going to be updated. So here's our 7-year look back here. That information is going to be updated to ensure that the public is aware of the progress being made to keep them safe from future weather events. So the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC, they have climate smart communities, which I'm sure folks may be familiar with. It is a terrific program. I would just say, if anyone from DEC is in the room, let the governor know I said that. But in all seriousness, it is a terrific program because it is thoughtful and provides the kind of toolkit that those of us in government need. And that's really the backbone of our initiative here. So this program is the state's effort to provide support, leadership, and grant money. I emphasize grant money because that's a wonderful carrot for local governments to get and induce folks to take action. Its work is measured by a checklist of 12 categories of preparedness. Scroll down, I believe that's there. This shows you on the map here, it's probably maybe a little small to see, but it gives you a sense of some of the different projects that have gone on post-Sandy. Scroll down to, okay. So there's a checklist that this program provides and takes you as a municipality through 12 categories of preparedness that can show you these are the steps you want to take in order to become more resilient. It provides a comprehensive checklist of initiatives, toolkits, it's action-oriented. The DEC provides potential grant funding to municipalities engaging in this kind of work. And it's funding for local governments who take this action, and that's why you want to sort of consider taking the plunge to be eligible for this grant funding. We have centralized this information. We make it easy to track, available to all, whether residents or our partners in government. And working with the DEC, we're encouraging municipalities all over to become certified as climate smart communities. So this lists some communities that have become certified. I'll give a shout out to the city of Long Beach, who after my time as city manager continued on and became the first in Nassau County to become bronze certified, not just certified. And we want to see folks move along that continuum from taking the pledge to certification and so on and so forth. So in our office, in the Comptroller's office, we've spent quite a lot of time in our first year and now into our second year in making the finances of the county easier to track. Now we can make our progress on issues that are so important, cut across so many issues, so many things like resiliency, easier to track as well. So we'll be keeping the public updated on how all of our municipalities are doing with regards to resiliency. We'll be reminding, gently nudging and nagging all the different communities in order to apply and move forward along this continuum, because it is it's not just the right thing to do, but from a financial perspective, it is vital for our economy going forward. It is so much easier to spend a little bit of money up front being protected than it is rebuilding from the storm. So thank you again. You are doing the right thing by being here and participating in this very thoughtful discussion, and I'm proud to be part of moving our region forward. Thank you, everybody.
All right, wonderful. We are going to move right along. Okay, and Larry, there's the clicker up here. So I'm going to introduce Larry Swanson, who's our moderator, and who's going to be presenting ahead of the panel discussion. Larry Swanson is Associate Dean and former Interim Dean of the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences here at Stony Brook. And he's the Director of the Waste Reduction and Management Institute here at Stony Brook. He received his PhD in oceanography from Oregon State University in 1971. He's a physical oceanographer working primarily on marine pollution issues in the coastal ocean. He has contributed to environmental policy debates concerning ocean dumping, marine debris, and sewage discharge criteria. And he's been an expert witness in marine boundary disputes argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. So, welcome, Larry Swanson.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming. Welcome to the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. It's a real pleasure to have you join us here at the university for this important event. And let me also emphasize that the way the university gets its money these days is by giving parking tickets. So if you don't have a parking pass, please make sure that you get one and park legitimately. I'm gonna, in many ways, sort of play the devil's advocate today, and I want to raise these issues with regard to natural resiliency. And my question is, are we acting too late? And I want to just go through things that are going on the island today that are not involving natural resiliency, and I just listed a number of them here. First of all, Suffolk County now requires that sea level rise be considered when it's planning its major revisions to its road work. Out here in the Peconic Bays, Suffolk County has approved spending some resources to examine how they're going to build resiliency for the bluff at Indian Island County Park. In this particular case, part of the problem is that it's a Native American burial ground. The erosion of the bluff is exposing those burial grounds, and so the county needs to protect them. And while they talk about they're going to do a natural and engineered revetment of some sort, in all likelihood it's going to have to be largely an engineered, hardened shoreline. Smithtown has just decided that they're going to raise 1,500 feet of Long Beach Road, about 1.7 feet. So they can't wait anymore. And Nassau County is exploring storm surge barriers. Storm surge barriers at various inlets, but they're also exploring a hardened structure that will go across the bay. So Nassau County is also looking at having to use engineered structures as opposed to natural structures. And of course, the village of Montauk is constantly in the news about what it's going to do to protect its beaches and whether or not the town is actually physically going to have to move. So my question is to all our panelists today, have we waited too long, or can we still move ahead and be successful with employing natural shorelines. I should also mention, I think it has been, in the last month and a half, there's been 4 emergency closures of Dune Road to public access for repair. So that's another area that is constantly suffering from not having natural barriers. And finally, I just might mention that if we don't do something, that the mortgage companies probably will. They will be deciding whether or not we will be able to build anywhere near the coastline. So I don't think we want to leave it up to the mortgage companies as to what we want to do, but clearly we have to advance what we are doing with regard to coastal resilience. So I'm going to stop there. I hope all the panelists keep these questions in the back of their mind as they answer. And I now want to introduce our panelists, so if you would come up as I read your name and say a few nice things about you maybe. First is Dr. Allison Bronco. She's the Director of Coastal Programs for the Nature Conservancy here in New York. She's focused on bringing science to decision making to help communities and government. Allison earned her bachelor's degree in zoology at Connecticut College and a PhD in oceanography from the University of Connecticut. Not from New York. Come on. She has also served as the director of the Peconic Estuary Program, which is part of EPA's National Estuary Program. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Look forward to your comments. Dr. Kathleen Fallon. Dr. Kathleen Fallon is the Coastal Processes and Hazardous Specialist at New York Sea Grant, located here at Stony Brook University. She earned her bachelor's degree in marine sciences at Stony Brook University. All right, see Allison? But she did wander away and go to Florida, where she earned her PhD in geosciences at the Florida International University. Sea Grant works to bring science to the shore by providing coastal managers with science-based information so that they can make informed decisions. Recently, Kathleen partnered with the South Shore Estuary Reserve to develop a series of resiliency forums. So Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us. Alexa Fournier. Alexa, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Alexa is with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and she's with the Coastal Resiliency Program. She also earned a master's degree in marine and atmospheric science. Where else? Stony Brook University, all right. And she got her BS in ecology and evolution and behavioral biology at Beloit College. Thank you so much for joining us. Michael DiGilio. Michael is a registered landscape architect and an associate at Cameron Engineering and Associates here in Woodbury. Michael is a fervent proponent of integrating green infrastructure into his projects. He's worked on projects including Wyandanche Rising, which I've heard a lot about recently. He's also been involved with designs at the campuses of Hofstra, Beloit College, and St. Joseph's College. Don't we need any help here?
We're always open to it.
He is designing and managing a living shoreline project for the village of Lindenhurst at this time at their Shore Road Park facility. So Michael, great to have you join us.
Thank you.
Mary Ann Russo. We had to have a lawyer. So here she is. She received her JD from the Touro Law School, but she also had a BA from Stony Brook University. So once again, great to have a Stony Brook alum. Thank you. Marion is the Executive Director of the Village of Patchogue Community Development Agency. This is really impressive. She successfully secured over $4 million in grants for the Village of Patchogue, including grants from the New York State Department of State for the design and construction of a living shoreline at Shorefront Park in Patchogue. So I think I got everybody. Thank you so much. I'm going to start off by asking a question of Allison. So put your thinking cap on. Can you speak to the importance of preserving natural spaces and coastal lands on Long Island in the context of resiliency to sea level rise and storm surges? And
Should I stand up? Should I sit?
you can come over here if you want, or I can give you that.
Okay. So first and foremost, I think it's important for everybody to remember that for most people on Long Island, the reason that we live here is not because we enjoy sitting on the Long Island Expressway for hours on end. It's because we like the coastline. Most Long Islanders live here because they like the coast, they like our natural beaches, our wetlands, our bluffs, and all of the things that go with that, wildlife and whatnot. And so those are the things that we want to try to protect. But in addition to that, those natural shorelines are actually protecting us as well. So the photo you hopefully can see behind us, the large photo is the back bays in Nassau County, and then down in the corner you can see a photo from Great South Bay on a windy day. And the point that I'm trying to demonstrate is that when you have those marsh islands, and this is true of wetlands along the shoreline as well, they really dampen down a lot of wave energy as it comes across our bays and harbors. And when you don't have those wetlands, the storm energy is stronger. And so when we have a natural shoreline between us and the water, we have that sort of buffer, that natural protection. So the wetlands themselves, because they have a lot of structure, they actually reduce the wave heights and the energy from the waves and their ability to damage things. I want to be very clear, you sometimes hear wetlands called a sponge. They do technically absorb a little bit of floodwater. There's no stopping a flood. The ocean is really big and there is so much water, nothing is going to stop it. But they do reduce a lot of that energy and help to protect what's behind it. So we want to always keep that natural shoreline, not just for the birds and the fish and because we like how it looks, but because it's protecting people as well. And the other thing about these natural shorelines, and this is true not just for wetlands, but for beaches and sand dunes and even bluffs, they're very resilient naturally, and they will adapt to sea level rise all by themselves as long as we let them. If we get out of the way and give them some space, as sea level rises, they will naturally move around and shift and change, but they will move inland a little bit, but they will always maintain there along our shoreline. So this is just one little piece of the south shore of Long Island. This happens to be Mastic Beach. And what you can see in blue is places where we currently have wetlands. And then in green is where wetlands would try to migrate to as sea level rises over the next 80 or so years. And you can see that we will always have a lot of wetland as sea level rises, as long as we allow it to do its natural thing, allow it to be flooded, which is what's necessary to allow those wetland plants to dominate and move inland. But all of the red that you can see is roads and houses and driveways, and this is the case everywhere on Long Island, not just here. Don't want to pick on anyone in particular. We're in the way. Because we love the coast so much, we've developed right up to the edge of it. So our wetlands don't have any room to migrate. So if we want to keep those natural shorelines that we love and that are taking care of us as well, we need to back up and give them a little bit of space. And all of the sand movement, even on barrier islands, the bluffs, the erosion, the accretion, all of those things, that's nature's way of being resilient and dealing and adapting to climate change. But we as humans need to just get out of the way and let it do its thing, and then we will always have these beautiful natural places that are so important to us.
Thank you, Allison. So is this not an area where Suffolk County is being very aggressive in trying to purchase homes that have been abandoned and things like that?
Yeah, this is one of those areas, and there are a few. Both Suffolk County and the town of Brookhaven are working really hard to purchase undeveloped properties as well as developed properties in this area to try to do exactly that, to protect those wetlands and give them room to migrate.
So do you think that is a wise policy that the
I
county
think
and
it's a
the
great policy. We just need so much more of it in so many more places, which is gonna cost a lot more money.
Okay. Kathleen, Long Island has a variety of shore types. Can you talk about these and about how natural shoreline strategies could be used for resiliency and to manage flooding?
Sure. So, as Allison was mentioning, we live here on Long Island. We live in communities that are close to the ocean. And because of our proximity to the coastline, we are susceptible to flooding. And we have different types of flooding that occurs. The one that comes with large storms. And then we also have nuisance flooding. Flooding that is occurring more frequently now as we're dealing with sea level rise and higher than high tides that are just a little bit higher than they were a couple of years ago. Long Island is also very unique because we have, for the most part, 3 very different shore types. We have coastal bluffs, we have sandy beaches, and we have bays, which are marshlands. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these 3 different shorelines, focusing on them, and then what are some natural resiliency measures you can take. So, like I mentioned, the Great South Bay, all of the Peconic Bay, our bays are lined with tidal wetlands. And as you mentioned, tidal wetlands act as buffers. They temporarily kind of store and store floodwaters, and they also decrease the wave energy. So some resiliency measures you can take along the bay shorelines are marsh restoration, which will protect the upland features, and living shorelines. So living shorelines are coastal engineered structures that increase the natural habitat and provide stabilization and risk reduction. They are constructed to mimic natural features and processes, and they provide the risk reduction while also increasing the ecological benefits of the structures. We have our sandy beaches. Our sandy beaches include the barrier islands that protect us from large waves along the south shore of Long Island. Beaches are extremely dynamic features. The sand is moving constantly. It's moving onshore, it's moving offshore, and it's also moving alongshore. So you have sand that is constantly moving in different directions. So you wind up with a situation where you might have erosion in one area, but yet you're having deposition in another. Then also our bluffs, I'm going to kind of lump them together because they kind of have the same natural resiliency options. Bluffs are coastal features. They are composed of glacial materials. This includes your sand, silt, clay, and larger sediments, including boulders. And the dominant issue with our bluffs is erosion. It's erosion from the top from runoff. It's erosion coming through the bluff face from groundwater, and also erosion at the toe from wave attack. And on the North Shore, we see that this erosion is episodic. You can go for a very long time with no erosion and then have a great erosion event. So the natural resiliency measures that you can kind of take with those things are focused around vegetative plantings. Vegetation is essential. It binds the sediments together. It also can trap wind-blown sediments and grow these features such as dunes and bluffs. I'm going to stop there. If you have more questions later, let me know. I can go back to it.
Okay, so thank you, Kathleen. Am I correct in saying that wetlands will not reduce or eliminate storm surge, but it will reduce the energy of the storm surge? Is that correct or not?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The other question I have for you is that you mentioned the importance of wetlands. But as sea level rises, the wetlands are migrating towards the center of the island, and there's where you run into property. People own this. So how can we allow for the growth of wetlands given that we're going to run into barriers, physical barriers in some cases, but barriers where people don't want their front lawn taken up by marsh expansion.
Yeah, so it is gonna be, it's gonna be a case-by-case process where we're going to hopefully, through Sea Grant, educate homeowners who are going to learn that maybe if your bulkhead fails, maybe the best option isn't to replace it with another bulkhead, but maybe instead considering to allow for a more of a living shoreline structure where you're bringing the marshes in and allowing them to move and migrate inland.
Okay, thank you. Allison, back to you. What are some benefits to natural shorelines in comparison to hardened strategies like bulkheads? Are there any examples of the two that you can share in the ability to buffer storm surges against storm tides?
Yeah, so this is a question that people ask all the time, and I think it's really important to remember, it's not that one is better than the other, it's really about what your goals are. And it's really the physics of your system that will determine what are the appropriate options for your location. But what we have to do is rethink our goals a little bit. Angela, can you put that upside down blue pyramid looking slide? Yeah. So this is the sort of decision-making structure that I would propose we use, because like Kathleen said, if we consider everything on a case-by-case basis, no homeowner is gonna say, I'll just take one for the team, we'll let the marsh be here, and everyone else can have their wall. We have to sort of back up and zoom out and take a bigger picture look. If everyone builds a wall, we will suddenly have a big concrete bathtub to live in, and I'm not sure that anybody wants to live on Long Island if it's a big concrete bathtub. These are not easy decisions to make. Thankfully, I'm not an elected official, and that's not really my responsibility today, but what we need to do is really think. We have two kinds of risk. We have storm risk, which can sometimes be really large and catastrophic, but is a little unpredictable and only happens once in a while and is very short-lived. We have that type of flooding, but then we also have sea level rise flooding here on the coast. And sea level rise flooding is much more slow-moving catastrophe, but it's guaranteed to happen, and it will be permanent. So when we consider both of those risks together, and we recognize that we're not just thinking 5 years out, we should be thinking a little bit long-term, and we should be thinking about the fact that we like nature on our coast and we like to keep it there, I would propose that getting out of the way of the water in many cases is our best bet. And of course that is not always possible. Certainly it's not always possible, and we don't want to be naive about that. But when it is possible, we need to do it. It's the best thing for us, for our families, for the nature that belongs in the place that we've put our house in the way. So first and foremost, we want to protect the natural shorelines that are still natural. So those of you here from local government, that means you. We need to sort of rethink our zoning a little bit. And if we do still have natural shorelines, maybe we need to try to protect them and not allow them to be built. Because really what we're doing is just putting people in harm's way. And then where we do have people in harm's way, this is America. We don't really force people to do things very often, but there are a lot of people dealing with a lot of flooding who are ready to get out. And we need to help them do that. So we need to create some more robust programs with a lot more money to help get them out of the way of the flooding. And over time, as these flood risks get worse and worse and worse, there will be a lot more people putting their hand up and saying, I'm done, I've had it, I want out, let the wetland grow here. So when those two things are not an option, and maybe that's because, you know, I just need to stay here 5 more years and then I'm gonna retire and move away, or maybe it's because, you know, I'm a marina, I have to be at the water, or maybe it's because our roads, you know, we can't have no roads at risk of flooding because we wouldn't be able to go anywhere in this country. So some of those types of infrastructure do need to be protected. So then we need to go through the different ways of protecting them and dealing with all that flooding from the least damaging to the most damaging. So first we want to try to accommodate all that water. That's where raising your house comes in. So raising your house will buy you a lot of time. You can get through several hurricanes with your house raised. Depending how high it is, you might be able to survive sea level rise. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to drive in and out and all that, but it gives you some time. So those are kind of passive risk reduction that you do. Just get up out of the way of the water, and that will buy you a little bit of time. There are other things you can do. Active risk reduction in New York City, they're starting to actually put off walls just when the storm comes and then take them down again so people don't lose their view. Then we can engineer things, and we want to try and do what Kathleen was just talking about, the most natural option that we possibly can that will work with the physics that we have to deal with. And that's really for the engineers to decide based on the fetch and the wave energy and all that. A living shoreline is the ideal, but it won't always work to quote unquote protect that shoreline. And if your goal is to stop erosion, sometimes you might need a wall. But we want that to be a last resort, not the first resort.
Thank you. So very recently, Senator Schumer has said that FEMA should, work with homeowners, and they shouldn't increase the prices of flood insurance too much and so forth. Is that the right thing to be doing?
That's a hard question. So here's the thing. We shouldn't have ever started it in the first place, but now we're here, right? We're in this position. All of these people are on the coast, and they've made the decisions they've made for their families and their finances based on this idea that they can insure their house and that the federal government will help them. So we can't just pull the rug out one day, wake up, and nobody has flood insurance anymore. That's obviously not going to happen. And because our elected officials are in charge of these decisions, they're not even willing to do that sometime down in the future, and that's a really difficult position to be in. But by helping people rebuild their house in a dangerous place, you're just dooming them to another disaster. We should not be keeping people in harm's way. We should be doing everything we can to get them out of harm's way. And I won't say that there's an easy answer to it, because there's certainly not. One thing that Canada has proposed is sort of like a one and done policy. So if you have flood insurance, you get one more payout. Either you rebuild your house and we'll never help you again, or we'll buy you out and you can go buy a house somewhere else safer. That's one solution that they've proposed in Canada. I don't know if they'll succeed in making that work. There are a lot of different things we can do. I don't know if it's easy, but I think continuing to rebuild in these vulnerable places, it just doesn't make good financial sense, much less moral sense.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad I don't have Alexa's job, because she has to deal with permitting. Alexa, can you give us a brief overview about DEC's Living Shoreline Guidelines?
Sure. All right. So following the destruction and ongoing saga of Superstorm Sandy back in 2012, Governor Cuomo created the NYS 2100 Commission. They were directed to create some recommendations for how to improve the state's resiliency overall. So their report came out in 2013, and one of the recommendations of this report was that New York State use and encourage the use of green and natural infrastructure as a way to improve resiliency to storms and flood events. Then the next year, in 2014, the Community Risk and Resiliency Act, or CARA, was signed. And CARA also promotes the use of living shorelines as natural buffers to climate change, along with many other climate-related resiliency adaptations. So once these two reports were released and acts were signed into law, at the DEC we started to develop the Living Shorelines Guidance. This was used to provide information to property owners, design professionals, and state permitting staff themselves who were reviewing or who were interested in designing or installing living shorelines. So CARA provided the direction to encourage natural resiliency measures, and this guidance was created to explain what these are and specifically how they work and how to go through the permitting process with the DEC. So to that end, we have defined with the DEC the living shorelines as techniques that incorporate natural living features alone or in combination with structural components such as rock, wood, fiber rolls, bagged shell, and concrete shellfish substrate such as oyster castles. Any of these techniques with both hard components and living components would be considered a hybrid shoreline. All of these shorelines must control or reduce shoreline erosion while maintaining comparable benefits to a natural shoreline. So providing for sediment movement in natural ways. They must use the minimum amount of structural components necessary. We don't want to put a whole bunch of rock if a small amount of rock will get the job done. Living shorelines must improve, restore, or maintain connection between the upland environment and the water. And finally, they need to incorporate habitat enhancements where possible. So generally that means revegetation to a natural shoreline. Some examples that are listed within the document and we've seen in the state would be an offshore rock sill with intertidal marsh and high marsh plantings behind that rock sill. Coconut fiber logs on an eroding shoreline planted with vegetation. Oyster castles are being used at a couple sites in the city. And the guidance document includes information on siting, which is where these types of shorelines would be most appropriate due to various erosive forces. As everyone knows, we have many different types of shorelines on Long Island, and living shorelines are more suitable for some than others, and different techniques can be used better in some places than other places. So the document includes a permit application checklist, a glossary of terms that are used in these projects, the sea level rise projections, which were generated from the CARA law, and examples of techniques for living shorelines.
Thank you. I want to back up a little bit with, if I can. So this is sort of a hybrid of a lot of different things. I don't know if anybody can see this, so let me turn the lights out. Are the bluffs in Nisququote. These trees are the same in all these pictures. Here was 2017. They got a rock revetment down here. They got a sort of a natural terrace thing here where they planted seagrass. Then we had Bats nor'easter in March of 2018. All the natural stuff has been washed away. The rock is still here. And then a year later, it looks like some of the natural stuff is starting to grow back. So my question to you, Alexa, is that one of the things that has been described to me is that the DEC considers this as sort of a leaky bulkhead, with the idea that some of the sand is going to leak through as the bluff erodes, come down to the beach, and then feed further downstream through littoral drift, the beach at Long Beach. So is this something that the DEC truly embraces, or sort of leaky bulkheads?
I have not heard that term leaky bulkhead. I do know that for a time there was the idea that with the bluffs, bluffs are kind of a tough case, to be honest, because there's, letting a bluff erode back is generally not palatable for the public, because generally people have houses right at the top of those bluffs. So as much as we might like to say, we'll just let it go and continue to supply the beach with sediments, that's not always a possibility due to personal property and hazards. So I think maybe what you're referring to is the idea that we used to, and actually I'm not over in the regulatory office at this point, so I'm not totally sure on what the current recommendations are, but for a time we were allowing some of these types of rock revetments, if presuming that they were in well landward of the high water line, so sort of back in the back of the beach, and we would encourage those to be covered with sand, or require them to be covered with sand, so that you got a buried toe, and when there was erosion from a storm, that sand that you had covered your toe revetment with would be then redeposited to the beach. As how much those were actually implemented, enforced, I can't tell you, because it's always very difficult. But I think that that's probably the idea that you're referring to. Again, I think it did seem that in that case there was quite a bit of sediments that had been deposited sort of just beyond the rock wall. Whether or not that gets moved up and down the shore, I guess remains to be seen.
Thank you. Michael, what are some considerations when deciding what kind of coastal management technique is best for a given location?
Sure. By the way, Larry, I love that term, leaky bulkhead. That's that's terrific. Yeah, I'm gonna have to find a better way to utilize that at some point. So really, as far as the considerations, begins with two. One is the erosion factors, such as I was spoken to earlier: currents, fetch, wave action, things of this nature. It's really energy is what we're talking about. And also the access needs. What does really the project require? What is the client or the municipality asking for? Do they want access? Do they still want an access for a beach? Do they want kayak launches? Do they want are there boating needs there? Because it's not all or nothing. You can integrate some of these access and the living shorelines together. So it begins with those two considerations. It also goes into weighing the potential impacts to adjacent areas. There's a good chance, because so much of our coastline is bulkheaded already. So you have this very speeding up, so to speak, of the currents, and then you're going to introduce a living shoreline there, which is great, which is what we want to do, but that slows it down. And then that sand, all of a sudden, now that sand slows down, it deposits somewhere. So you have to take all that into consideration. That sedimentation, if you have an adjacent canal, that could be a little bit problematic, but nothing can be overcome, because you don't want to all of a sudden accidentally solve one problem and then cause another by depositing too much sand in the canal. Now it's not navigable anymore. Examples like that. There's also impacts to adjacent habitats to consider. So if you do have a living shoreline, and depending on some of the considerations, you may put some of the more hardened components like the rock sill. Depending on the needs in the engineering, you may have to put it a little bit further seaward than you would have originally liked. And now all of a sudden you're into an analysis of essential fish habitat and things of that nature. So again, just all considerations. Nothing can be overcome or understood or analyzed, but it's just all additional considerations. Now the analysis circles back to the forces and the erosion factors. Again, these were spoken about earlier, and I think those examples, Larry, that you just showed up on the screen over there, really show it well. The coastal environment is the harshest environment. All the projects in my career spanned, coast to coast, on the island that is, north to south, and all areas inland in between. The coastal environment is just so harsh. It's just unforgiving, and I may be a little bit jaded in my experience with some of that, but it's because it's just so harsh. So you do need to introduce some structural components to address the wave action, dissipate that really strong wave action and wind that comes along. If you're on the coast, there's nothing buffering the wind. It's coming right in. So there was some mention of some of the structural means. There's been used gabion walls, which are nothing more than rock-filled mesh crates. There's of course the rock sills, and there's the size of the stones to consider. You can use Alexa mentioned the size of the stones. We don't want to over-engineer. We certainly don't want to over-engineer them either. But it does come into play because again, when you factor in all of a sudden when you have a large amount of fetch, which is the measured distance across the water. So on the Great South Bay, it's the distance from the barrier islands to the South Shore. When you factor in, it's about 3 miles across. That is a lot. That's a lot of wave energy, elevation, and just lastly, quickly, long-term monitoring. If you're a municipality, you're getting into this. You have to understand that long-term, you have a 5-year obligation. Once your permitting goes through, you're committed to a 5-year obligation to monitor this. That's again, that's just something that just has to be considered and factored into the costs there.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to ask you a little bit about accretion and emulsion. So I'm living on a beach that's fed by the erosion of those bluffs that I just showed you. What right do I have to that eroding bluff to maintain the beach in front of my house?
Oh boy, okay, that's a good question. Not an attorney, but what right? Typically, well, first of all, it starts with your property line. So that's the first. That's the first element that you look at, and then beyond that, what rights do you have? Well, it depends on New York State DEC jurisdiction and Army Corps jurisdiction, and what rights do you have? Well, you certainly have rights. The matter is, what do you? Really, the question becomes, what are you permitted to do? So you may hire a professional. You may have some ideas yourself. Maybe your neighbor's done something, legal or not, to mitigate some of that erosion or stabilization. So what are your rights? Well, again, first off, it starts with ownership. What's your land versus state land? There's a lot of the actual water is owned by, that land is owned by the state, and then so, but just speaking plainly, most of the jurisdiction does fall within DEC and Army Corps and the joint permit that you have to initiate to begin the process.
Thank you. Alexa, going back to you, can you discuss the living shoreline permitting process? And do you have any advice to help applicants in that process? Also, can you put this process into context with the newly passed climate law, and I should also say ocean acidification law,
No.
because of marshes?
Right. Okay, so I would say the first step, and I'll go a little bit before the permitting process, but the first step I would say to anyone who's interested in putting in some sort of living shoreline would be to reach out and speak to the estuary programs, whatever, depending on what shoreline you're on. It could be the Peconic Estuary Program, Long Island Sound Study, or the South Shore Estuary Reserve. They also Sea Grant, I know, has a lot of public outreach. There are many groups of people that are able and willing to meet with you on your site, discuss various options, and think about ideas you might not have had, identify grant opportunities. Sometimes, especially for municipalities, there are different pots of money that are available for installing this type of structure. So it's good to know about the opportunities that are there. But once you have sort of a rough idea of what you'd like to get, the first step I would recommend would be to set up a pre-application meeting with the DEC. And the best way to do that would be to submit an application in writing to the permit administrator at here would be Region 1, and Regions 2 and 3 have their own administrator. That will give you a chance to sort of meet face to face with the people that will be reviewing your permit and your permit application, and sort of get their feedback as to if what you're thinking is in line with what might be able to be approved. Now, another thing to keep in mind for these types of projects, because they tend to be rather complex and they require a very delicate handling of elevations and modeling waves and energy, things like that, a lot of these projects are best suited to design professionals. Sometimes, back in the good old days when everyone was putting in a bulkhead, you could get a dock builder to submit your permits for you. You could just, draw up the plans for a bulkhead and submit them. But because these are kind of much more complicated in their creation, it may be necessary to actually hire somebody to sort of help you develop these plans. Again, you'll need things like elevation data, wave energy modeling, things like that. The big thing for many of these projects is going to be overcoming the reasonable and necessary clause. Essentially, we have regs under the Tidal Wetlands law that require certain things, and if you want to do things beyond what is generally acceptable, you have to prove that they are both reasonable and necessary. So you want to look at some of the alternatives. Is retreat possible? Can you move what you're doing to another spot so that whatever is at risk of erosion is no longer at risk? You want to provide an alternatives analysis. That will be part of the application process. Now, an alternatives analysis will be done to understand the trade-offs inherent in various project types. So there's the do-nothing alternative, which essentially you do nothing, then what happens? What would be the cost of that in the long term? Retreat, again, siting the upland structures in a different way, removing a single structure entirely, and then evaluating reasonable alternatives. So in general, we would have, say, the living shoreline would be one of your alternatives, a traditional bulkhead or revetment would be another alternative. And when you're sort of doing this exercise, you're able to provide cost estimates and impacts estimates to sort of evaluate these options side by side. So you could say if we did nothing, it would cost nothing, but also we would lose our house. If we put in a bulkhead, it would cost as much and then create issues downstream, so on and so forth. And so once you have this in hand, it becomes easier to discuss your alternatives. And I guess that's the biggest part. Again, we need to consider climate change within these projects. So looking at projected sea level rise to predict future impacts to neighboring properties, and then demonstrate that this particular living shoreline technique that you've proposed is appropriate for the site in question. And again, as Michael mentioned very briefly, always you want to consider the maintenance and monitoring aspect of these projects. We're going to require a 5-year monitoring with any living shoreline, so that's something that should be rolled into the budget. You know, just know that every year you'll have to do some small amount of monitoring and submit that. So.
Thank you. So this is sort of a question for Alexa, you and for Michael. And this goes back again to one of my experiences dealing with Central Long Island Sound. You mentioned it's important perhaps to get a professional. How do you know that you have a good professional? And the reason I ask that is that the case that I'm referring to, the professional came in and said, oh, the tide range here is 4 feet. Well, the tide range is actually 7 feet. So how do you assure that you get a good quality professional helping you? Because the investment in these projects is huge. So you want to know, you want to really have first class help if you're going to be involved. So can they go to you? Can they go to other places to get advice as to who to hire?
Well, as I'm sure everyone understands, it's very difficult for us as a state agency to recommend anyone in particular. We can't, basically we can't do that. But what we can do and what we have done in the past is provide a list of consultants and other professionals that we that we have worked with in the past or that have done other living shorelines. So you this is a list of people who have done them, and maybe you can go check out some of their work and see how it looks. Again, it's hard even for us when we're hiring contractors to find one that knows what they're doing. So it can be really hard, and I imagine for just the general public at large, not knowing what to look for, it's hard. But I would always just try and look at their body of work and see if they have any successes in their portfolio. And again, as the idea of installing these living shorelines becomes more readily accepted, I think it will become easier to see this guy's got a lot of projects, but half of them are now underwater. So maybe move on to the next, that kind of thing. I think we're sort of in the early days too.
Yeah, just speaking, when we're representing a municipality, after we put together a set of bid documents, it goes out to bid, we review everything. And one of the things we do is look at all the references, all the job references, and I suggest and that's on a contractor basis, on a for professional services. When we're asked to provide proposals, we got to put together, our design proposals. They're anywhere from this big to this big, and part of that is our recent relevant experience as well as references. And when we are representing the municipality, we don't hesitate to roll in references, and quite frankly, we stand secure on the references we put in there in the document. And I would encourage any municipality to go utilize those references, call them up, ask the mayor or DPW superintendent, how did they perform? Is it still holding up? In that 5-year window, did you have to do a lot of replacement mitigation?
Thank you. Marion.
Yes.
Can you share your experience with the project at Patchogue Shorefront Park? From your perspective, what are some of the challenges to implementing living shorelines?
So I guess if you could just go to the slide, I don't know where we have this, but we have, I just have a couple of slides.
Oh, she's got it.
All right,
Oh.
good.
She's doing it.
Okay.
There we go. So this first slide will show you the storm surge from Sandy. So our park project is here on the lower right, and then if you go to the next slide, this is our project. It's been changed a little bit, but basically we're doing the type of project that Alexa, I think, spoke about, where we have the rock seals going out into the water. Right now, the village has a bulkhead this is what the plan is, because the village received, I'll go back to the beginning, the village received a donation of $5 million to upgrade all of its parks, so that created a fund. And the Shorefront Park is our most utilized park. It's 7 acres on the Great South Bay, and just north of it we have another 20 acres of parkland. When Sandy hit and Irene, the whole park was inundated, and we received this donation to do this type of work, and one of the residents suggested perhaps looking at a living shoreline. Our initial plan was just to replace the bulkhead, and he had less damage through Sandy. So we began the process. We had hired through the donation Cornell Rothschild, which is the landscape architect. They've done work in Port Jefferson and Greenport and the Battery Park. and VHB are engineering consultants, and they have an office in Virginia that has experience working, doing living shorelines in the Chesapeake Bay. And so they've done a lot of the work that Michael spoke about regarding the waves and all, and we had geotechnical work done to make this plan. The way we're paying for it is through a Department of State grant. We have a local waterfront revitalization program, and in that program we talked about doing work along Shorefront Park. We were able to put that in a grant application to Department of State. We received $200,000 towards a $400,000 design budget. That's how much it's going to cost us to design this. And then we received a second grant for construction. We received $2.1 million towards the living shoreline construction. It's about $1 million. And then we're going to put a boardwalk, which is an amenity for the public, which is about another $1 million. We received $375,000 from New York State Parks for furnishings and plantings, and another $45,000 from the DEC for habitat restoration within the living shoreline area. So we've had several meetings, as Alexa says. The DEC is willing to meet with us, and we have met. And because we received a Department of State grant, we have now, not only are we applying, we make permit applications to the Army Corps and to the DEC, but we have Department of State consistency review that we also have to go through. So we've had to, when we've successfully had projects where we've, meetings where all three agencies have met. At this point, we had our designs preliminarily approved, but at this point right now, we're dealing with jurisdiction issues. Right now, the village has jurisdiction over the entire Shorefront Park because the bulkhead was built prior to when jurisdiction went to the DEC, or they would have had jurisdiction. So it's not jurisdictional. The village can do whatever work it needs to do in the park. We put in 2 playgrounds. We updated our band shell. Whatever, we have the Great South Bay Music Festival, which brings 15,000 people each year to our park. And all of that happens without having to go for a permit, or approvals from the DEC. At this point, in order to do this project and receive, we're having discussions with the DEC that there's a request or a requirement that we give up jurisdiction to our park, and that's not something the mayor is willing to do. So at this point, we're at a bit of a negotiation with the DEC. The mayor is willing to covenant to prevent further construction at the park or any development, and preserve it as parkland. But he's not willing to give over to his successors issues that may come up with it when the leadership at the DEC or the leadership at the village changes. You have to renew every 5 years, and then in 10 years you have to do a new permit. So that's additional cost the village is going to have to take on. We're willing to give jurisdiction to the living shoreline, but not to the entire 7-acre park. So those are the challenges we have right now.
New York State always makes everything so easy, right? So did you get your money first, or did you get your permits first?
But we don't have our permits, so we received the money first. And I recommend you do it in a two-step process. I mean, thankfully, we had this donation. I don't know that the village could have done this project without that private donation, because the design itself is $400,000. We have to tell the public, look, instead of replacing the bulkhead, we're gonna do this living shoreline. And guess what? The taxpayer's gonna pay $200,000 towards it, and it may work. And you're gonna have a different park. It's gonna look different, and you're gonna see rocks instead of the water. And so getting that approval. So I think it's good in steps. First you do the design, and first you get those approvals. So you need to have the money to do the design, and then you can go ahead with the construction. But then, of course, they said it's $1 million it's a 1,300 foot living shoreline. And I don't know, Alexa could probably tell you, I think it might be the largest right now.
That I know.
The longest on Long Island. Yeah, so that's, so I think the first thing to do is get the public input, and then have the money for the design.
Did you meet with the Department of State and DEC together, or?
Yes, we had joint meetings with the Department of State, the DEC, and the Army Corps.
Very good. Probably not easy to do.
No, setting up the meetings was probably one of the most challenging parts of this project.
Thank you. Michael, Can you talk about a natural coastal resiliency project your firm has worked on Long Island and some of the lessons learned?
Sure. So for starters, what Alexa mentioned about the preliminary meeting with the New York State DC, I can't understate the value in that, because what that really does is lay the groundwork and just gives you a candid inside picture of what is coming up, and what level of information, documentation, and a snapshot of the look ahead there. So that I highly encourage, and that could be done. I gotta say the DEC is fantastic about that. It may not happen in a week, but if you just give them the courtesy of, let's say, a month or so, and it'll help if you give them a little bit of context. You don't have to have a design professional. I don't believe at that point. You can just meet with them with just even the most remote conceptual plan to just give them an understanding, and they'll give you some quick feedback that will help guide you in putting together an RFP for professional services. But quickly moving on, time is a big consideration. It is always underestimated. On a typical joint application projects, I would tell clients 6 months is the duration to get through the process, but when it comes to living shorelines, I'd say that's more like 9 to 12 months to get through the process, and that's not. Again, remember, it's basically 3 big steps. It's New York State DEC, New York State DOS, Department of State, and U.S. Army Corps. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Army Corps is it is a relative. The term living shoreline, of course, has been around for a while, but in its formal sense, as Alexa said, the guidelines, the guidance document came out in 2017. The way Army Corps works is they have 54 national permits. Nationwide permits is what they refer to. Living shorelines is number 54. It only came around in 2017. So what the living shoreline nationwide permit is essentially somewhat difficult to fit in a box. And so some of the lessons learned there is that if you want to integrate other components that aren't a straightforward living shoreline, it's a little bit challenging, and again, nothing can be overcome, but you got to build in time, and you got to give some of that support and the justification. Because the minute you introduce something that's slightly outside the box, you have to provide all sorts of justification. As Alexa said, the minute you introduce a fill, stone, any of those rock sills we mentioned, if they're in the water, they're considered fill, and you have to provide justification and mitigation. You have to justify saying, okay, we're going to put 12,000 square feet of this rock sill in. Now we got to provide twice as much of either tidal planting or some other acceptable form of mitigation in its place. So some of the quick lessons learned is we did this private golf club in the South Shore of Long Island. Really over there, the quick challenge there, that was done under the general Sandy permit, or emergency condition. One of the issues there had to do with, we put a living shoreline in there, and there was no, I'll say, structured protection, and very quickly, it got annihilated. Just the currents, the wave, it just got annihilated very quickly. So quick, the contractor was still on site. It was a very large project that we actually went right back to the DC and said, listen, can we do some of the other hardened solutions that we're using elsewhere on the property? They said yes, and we moved on. So that was a quick lesson learned there. We did a project on the North Shore of Long Island, a park there, where we did, we did implement a lower rock sill and an upper rock sill, and that has withstood the test of time, and we're very happy and proud about that. And then on the this park in Lindenhurst, basically we are again utilizing the rock sills at the lower level, the upper level. But again, those rock sills, boy, I can't tell you how much. I'm not gonna say trouble, but issues. It's a grinding through. But we are in the home stretch, and I really believe we're only about a month or 2 away from our permits.
Thank you. Marion, what advice would you give to another Long Island municipality that is considering a natural coastal protection project?
I know I was supposed to prepare for this. No, I guess it would be a matter of being prepared to, New York State, you can get grant funds, but you need to show that there's community input and preparation. So you're really having a local waterfront revitalization program or some other kind of study that's been done to support that is really important in order to access grant funds. And there are grant funds available. As you can see, we received over $2.5 million to do this project. So those grant funds are available to do that. I also think we have a difficulty because we have a bulkhead and we're not willing to give up jurisdiction if there's an area that's more that doesn't have that hardened shoreline already. that it's, I know Tenebrook Haven's just a quarter mile away is going to be doing a living shoreline, but they're taking back property that had been inundated from Sandy. So I guess choosing the location is a good idea, so that you may not have the same conflicts and challenges that we have. And I suppose just, you know, I think just being, you know, having the public be understanding and open-minded about it. So, and having the political will.
Thank you. So would transfer of development rights work in this situation that you have?
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of what the mayor is talking about. I mean, it is, the way the property is zoned now, it could possibly be developed, but it's been a park for over 60 years. There's no, the village isn't, you know, we'll want to preserve that. So yes, they could covenant against development. So they wouldn't transfer development rights, but they would covenant against it, and the village would retain ownership and retain jurisdiction except for the living shoreline, which obviously, having the benefit of receiving grant funds and having this new treatment, that would be something that, but it's, the original plan would have gone 70 feet into our park. So we've given, but we were able to go into the water a little bit, but we're still giving up some of our park. But we don't want to give up jurisdiction of the entire park. But we will, you know, understand why the living shoreline itself would be under the jurisdiction of the DEC.
So how did you get around alienation of park land?
Oh, the mayor's predecessors did that about 60 years ago.
Okay.
That had been property that they had purchased.
Okay. Kathleen, you have the hammer. What are the options homeowners and residents can take to be more resilient? And do people living more inland have a part to play in coastal resiliency? I thought people living inland, sort of like myself, we're sort of cheering. I'm glad I couldn't afford that shoreline property.
So I want to begin with saying that you can increase your resiliency, but there is always going to be some level of risk when you live on the waterfront. The options I'm going to give right now, there's 4 of them. They are to reduce your risk from flooding, but again, it's not a guarantee. It's not, you know, 100%. As we've gone over, any coastal construction, it will require you to apply for permits, and cost is a major consideration, not only the initial, but the initial cost of the development or whatever option you choose. Then plus maintenance over time. Is it going to last 100 years? Is it going to last 10 years? Are you going to have to do more? So the 4 options, the first one, do nothing. Erosion and flooding, they're natural processes. So it would be appropriate to do nothing, especially if erosion and risk to a structure or a habitat is minimal. If the property has natural protective features and or the structures are set back away enough from the coastline. The pro for doing nothing, low cost, no cost, and easy to implement, no permit. Con, unexpected results. The flooding and erosion will continue. Second option, conserve. Sand dunes and wetlands serve as natural protection from storm surge and waves. And they can reduce the flooding and damage to structures. So basically just conserving the natural features, and those natural features will help protect your property from storms. You can plant native coastal species. Important, native. They are meant to live in these environments. They know how to thrive. And designate walkovers to prevent destruction of any habitats. You don't want to go walking across a dune. Pros for conserving, low cost, and you're enhancing the habitat. Cons, habitats will respond dynamically to storm events, and it's not protecting against long-term erosion. Raising, you can reduce your structural damage by raising your home on top of flow-through or pile foundations. It'll allow the water to move through, not through the house, under the house. Consider raising the structure to the recommended base flood elevation plus 2 feet. This will give you that little bit of a wiggle room to consider sea level rise. However, you need to check your local zoning codes. Some of them have height restrictions. Pros, you're going to reduce your flood impact. hazard impacts. You can also reduce your flood insurance premiums. And con, it's expensive. It's going to be expensive to raise your homes. You might have a height restrictions, and again, you're not reducing your erosion. Last option, relocation. Relocate out of the flooded area altogether. You could do this by selling your home. You can do this if you have a large enough property by moving your home further away from the coastline. Or you can move your entire home onto a new property. And that'll hopefully be outside of the flood zone. You could also participate in a block buyout program. This would entail selling your property to the government. It will hopefully allow the abandoned park property to be restored to natural land. The pro of this, you've completely eliminated your risk to flooding. But the cons, expensive, challenging, time consuming, and you can possibly lose your connection to your community if you decide to move away.
Thank you. What obligation does a homeowner that wants to sell his property in order to relocate have to be honest and straightforward with a prospective buyer?
I don't think there's any obligation.
Legally, there's no obligation.
There's no obligation legally.
No.
There is a disclosure that every seller has to make, but I haven't been practicing real estate in a while, but so there's a disclosure in New York State, but I'm not sure to what extent you have to disclose that, but it's usually buyer beware.
Wow. Okay, so we want to open it up to questions. You want to take care of this?
Sure, I can do that. Thank you, Larry.
I wanted to, first of all, just say thank you to the panel for your time and expertise.
Okay, before we start audience Q&A, which we have about 10 minutes or a little over if folks want to hang around 5 or so minutes after, we do have a short evaluation that we want to hand out now, just so that if you're interested in filling it out, you get to before you run out the door. Lisa's going to hand them out. If you can just leave them on the table, or really pretty much put them anywhere and we'll find them. Okay, that's the only thing I wanted to mention, and thank you again, and thank you again, Larry. Let's give Larry a round of applause. So how we'll do the audience Q&A is just raise your hand, and we'll call on you, and whatever panelist you want to answer your question. Yeah, in the back.
Question for Alexa. We have Jeff Murphy, Town of Riverhead. We have a project right on Iconic Bay being proposed 200,000 square feet of resort tourism development.
Will you stand actually so we can hear you? Thanks.
I can pop out. They are, their adjacent area is about the 10-foot contour line, and their consultant is saying that they're excluded from any DEC jurisdictional area, and therefore they can know basically what they want. How do we respond to that?
Well, I would say it's probably prudent to verify. You could require them to submit a letter of non-jurisdiction. That's something that anyone can apply for to the DEC. It's a jurisdictional inquiry, and they can say your property is out of jurisdiction for these particular set of regulations. The other thing would be, I suppose even if they are outside of DEC jurisdiction, certainly there would be some kind of a building code that would come into effect. I would think. And that the unfortunate thing with the 10-foot contour rule does mean that once there are many areas which are they are subject to the risks of climate change and sea level rise and things like that, but they are at this point we're not able to regulate those developments because they are.
That's my follow-up question. How do you regulate the forecast of sea level rise?
Right.
The next 20 years that 10-foot contour line is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly feel that's something that will become more of a pressing issue, and there may actually be steps to address that at some point, because again, you're looking at a height, and then if the bottom keeps moving up, then maybe the top needs to be moving up as well. I haven't heard of any actual steps taken that direction, but I think that's something that it's on everyone's mind, and hopefully it will be able to become incorporated into the law.
By the way, I'm surrounded by consultants who are smiling at me right now. And he's raising his hand.
I have a question for Alexa as well. My name is Rob Herman, and consultants with my wife Susanna. We're a permitting firm. So, Alexa, I'm kind of finding myself struggling now with something you're talking about today. I'm trying to understand to what level is this living shorelines permitting, as you described it today, integrated with or separate from the tidal wetlands permitting process? Because we have a project in Mattatuck, for example, that we designed what we thought was this perfect poster child living shoreline project with a low sill bulkhead so that's underwater at all high water events, and then recreating about 3,000 square feet of intertidal marsh as a way of helping with the erosion of the upland embankment. That application has been in review probably for about 8 months. It was originally objected to because of the placement of fill, but of course you needed to place the fill in order to recreate the wetlands because the shoreline was so badly eroded that you didn't have the right elevation or slope anymore. Staff didn't seem to be sure why they were objecting. They thought maybe it was coming from something having to do with living shorelines. We'd actually gotten we thought we had an okay for the permit about 6 weeks ago. We still haven't seen it. We still haven't, it's being told it's still under review. So and I'm asking this in front of a public forum, not just to try to find out about my project, but really as a standard operating procedure. If we know any consultant or agent or engineer or whoever is designing one of these living shoreline projects, I'm not aware of any separate like living shoreline permit, but maybe there is one, or how, in other words, how do you integrate the two? Because we know we need a tidal wetlands permit, but how do we get you all involved, with a typical project like that, so that we don't go 8, 9, 10 months trying to figure out who's actually looking at this?
Right, so that's a good question. And I, sort of rushed through this earlier in one of my first responses, but I mentioned that this tidal wetlands guidance document was both for the public and for state permitting staff. So it actually is a new, sort of a new horizon for everyone. And there are several, the whole program, we're all kind of coming to terms with this at the same time. So I think the underlying issue with a lot of these living shorelines in the past has always been that we have sort of a blanket prohibition of putting fill in the wetlands. So that's been like, everyone knows you can't put fill in a wetland. But that's changing. I mean, now that we are faced with like such dramatic levels of sea level rise and sort of understanding that our marshes are getting drowned out, all of our shorelines are eroding away, we are starting to accept the idea that maybe we do need a little bit of fill in order to allow those environments to thrive and to continue to migrate, whatever it is. We may need to now put fill in wetlands. So what was before considered presumably incompatible, basically never going to happen, is now going to happen. But like I said, we're all trying to roll this out together, and it is the same permit. It's not any special kind of permit. It's really just that when in your justification for a living shoreline, sort of the burden is upon the applicant to explain why it's important and why you need this fill here. And again, I mean, a lot of this is just kind of case by case. We're trying to get through each one as it comes in. And again, I'm not actually in that office at this point. I'm not really involved with the day-to-day stuff. But I think it is something that we are trying to work on both internally and public facing. So I think it's a learning curve. Hopefully you got good sounding news recently, and it will maybe come along after that. But yeah, it really is just even departmental overcoming of this sort of long-held beliefs that certain things are unacceptable. Now we're kind of having to shift that, and I think it's just hard for everyone to kind of come around and kind of realize that's what's happening here. We're not trying to fill in this wetland so that you can have a tennis court. We're trying to fill in this wetland so that the wetland can keep growing.
To recreate the marsh, right?
Yes, exactly. So
should people contact your office on an application like that, or just?
Well, it's a good question. Ideally there should be better coordination. I generally do get involved, through my office on the living shoreline components. So yes, sure. But in general, yeah, they're supposed to, sort of be this cross communication, and it doesn't always happen properly. Given the dilution of.
Okay, let's go on to the next
But,
question
sorry.
in the back.
Ryan McCarran, City Long Beach, again for Alexa. Is there a requirement through the grant program for nitrogen reduction?
I would say there are many different grants, and probably some do and some don't. I know there is a WQIP. I'm sorry?
For the Living Shoreline Program.
Well, we don't have a grant specific to the Living Shoreline Program. There are grants from the Climate Smart Communities Act, which is through DEC, and there are also WQIP, which is the Water Quality Improvement Program. Some years will have an aquatic habitat restoration component. This past round it did not, but 2 rounds ago it did, and that's what's contributed a bit of money towards Marion's project and also some towards the Lindenhurst project. But those, and generally nitrogen is not the main focus for Living Shoreline. There is, some associated benefits of nutrient absorption, if you're putting in plants, but it's pretty dilute, so I would say that's not generally the main focus. Sometimes they have stormwater mitigation programs that are looking at capturing.
Reducing the effectiveness of wetlands. So I would think using state resources, we would want to see the living shorelines reducing their reduction load either through the vegetation or through pesticide reduction or river mitigation.
Yes, I mean certainly so, and like I said, there may be some opportunities that are more focused on that particular factor than others. A lot of times these are projects that are pretty small in size, and so I would think any type of benefit to groundwater improvements would be pretty minor. But I mean, again, it's on a whole it's important, and if everyone's doing them, it will be a measurable success. But I think on a case by case, it's hard to justify one for that reason. Okay.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. I saw another hand. Yeah.
I was just trying, if I can do the question, about if we were gonna set up a pre-application meeting for Living Shorelines. I just wanted to hammer that home. So we could ask to have somebody from the Living Shoreline group attend our pre-application meeting?
Yes, yeah, you could, I mean, it's not really a group, it's just me. Full disclosure.
We can ask you specifically to be there.
Yes, yes, you can mention that. And again, like I said, I know the Peconic Gateway program in particular. Like I was out at a site with them a couple weeks ago where somebody had contacted them interested in putting in kind of like a neighborhood living shoreline, and they were out there, I was there, Kathleen was there, and we were sort of just discussing options about what they might do and the different types of things that might work based on their conditions. So yes, I would, yes. And actually at the back of the room, I have a little piece of paper that has the web address for the Tidal Wetlands Guidance document. I didn't print them out because they're very long, but everyone is welcome to look that up and print them or look at them on your computer. And also on there is the address and phone number for the Region 1 DEC permit office. They have a duty desk, because basically one of their analysts will be on duty Wednesdays and Fridays. You can walk in or call in with permit questions. So that's the kind of thing you could also ask them. And so those hours and phone number is written down on the paper in the back.
Is that how we get in touch with you?
No, that's just the number for the permitting. I mean, like I said, I'm not directly involved with permitting. I'm sort of here to promote various types of coastal resiliency, and of which living shorelines are one. I also do a lot of marsh restoration on state lands. I'm located at the Setauket office and not in Stony Brook. But when living shoreline projects come in, I generally like sort of notified and will occasionally get involved. So. Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for any of the other people? I know we don't love you, Alexa, but anyone have any other questions for any of the other panel? Yeah?
It's more a general question, and it's a general frustration that I have, so I don't know who should answer it. But I appreciate the fact that there are efforts by all municipalities to do all of these living shorelines and things. But at the end of the day, and I know it's been mentioned, but it can't be mentioned enough in terms of, is the zoning. It's like the cheapest way to do, not necessarily the cheapest, but the most realistic and the most effective way to protect the coastlines, in my opinion, has always been don't build. And if something is changing hands, if there's some way, we have those cases, in Hampton Bays where, it's frustrating that they're rebuilding so close to the shore. Is anything coming up that maybe we don't know about? Is it being discussed?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Basically, our whole society is based on this idea. We're managing land use on a two-dimensional map where the lines stay there forever and ever. And the fact is, on the coast, that's just not the case anymore. Because sea level is rising, those lines are moving around. And eventually we need to come to terms with that and figure out a new system to manage the coast, because we can't just let everybody expect those lines to stay there forever, because they just won't. We can't control that. We can't stop the ocean as much as we might like to. So I don't know of anybody that's figured out a revolutionary way to fix zoning and make it really easy, but there are tools already available, rolling easements and things like that. You know, rolling easements is just one sort of thing when you create an easement for that shoreline and it just moves. As the shoreline moves in, the easement does too. But you have to put these things in place, and it can be very difficult, especially politically, because people have something and now you're trying to take it from them, and that's really hard. So like you said, on transfer and things like that makes it a little bit more palatable sometimes. But it's a really hard problem that we're not going to solve. I do want to just mention, because Larry brought it up, transfer of development rights, which is another sort of land use tool available. So just recently, Assemblyman Thiel and Senator Laval sponsored legislation that passed and was just signed by the governor so we have this transfer of development rights enabling legislation at the state already for a lot of different reasons. It's why we have the Pine Barrens Transfer of Development Rights program. So now they have made it so that flooding and sea level rise is another reason to create a sending and receiving district. So it's not mandating anybody to do anything, but it's created a new tool for local governments to create a sending district in an at-risk neighborhood and a receiving district, because don't forget, these people have to go somewhere. And the more you plan that and make it a desirable place to go, make the people that they're moving in with happy to have them, all of those things, it's going to be a lot more successful that way. So there's a lot of planning that needs to go into that. And so it's really on the local governments and the planners. I know we have a lot of planners who work for consulting firms here. It's really on those folks to figure out, where do we create that? And it's an opportunity. You can create economic development opportunities in safe, high ground and create a desirable place so that those homeowners getting flooded all the time have a place to go. So it's not easy, it won't be cheap, and it won't be fast. But the fact is, the water is coming really fast, and we need to get moving on it.
Okay, I think that's about enough, as much as we have time for. So one more round of applause, please. Thank you all so much for attending today. Please visit our website, www.nylcdef.org, to learn more about us, and stay tuned. Thanks.